Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you're joining us from. Thank you for this really warm welcome and generous introduction. My name is Riga Shakya. Some of you may know me. Otherwise, I'm very much, happy and grateful to make your acquaintance today. Um, Thank you for the generous introduction to my research. I won't go over that. I'm delighted to be here today. With the French Society of Tibetan Studies to share some of my work. It's a particular pleasure to speak, albeit virtually, to colleagues and friends in Europe, especially at a time when international travel remains uncertain. I'm grateful for this opportunity to connect across the borders and time zones. And today I'll be presenting some material from my current book in progress, Mirrors of History, The Poetics of Tibetan Kingship in the Time of the Qing Empire. The book focuses, as Francoise has mentioned, on Tibet's last late kingdom on the cusp of Qing imperial consolidation, and also considers how the historical memory of this kingdom has shaped and continued to shape contemporary Sino-Tibetan political discourse. Before I go into my PowerPoint, I'd like to offer a special thanks to Francoise, Camille, Maria, and Emanuela for their generous help in organizing the talk today. I'm now going to share my screen. I think everyone can see my screen. So, as a child walking through the city of Lhasa on a rare family visit, I would pass a concrete tenement building. 4 stories tall, this public housing block was one of many such brutalist structures that formed the new socialist cityscape of modern Lhasa. Little did I know then that this innocuous building was constructed in 1994 atop the ruins of the 16th century Ganden Kansa, an imposing palace complex once home to the political rulers of central Tibet, which witnessed some of the most transformative moments in Sino-Tibetan history. In 1642, it was the site of the providential first audience between the fifth Dalai Lama and Gushri Khan, the founder of the Mongolian Koshot Khanate, who together inaugurated the rise of the Ganden Podang, or the Tibetan state. While no longer visible today, the stately home casts a long shadow in history, remembered foremost as the palace of the Tibetan king Polhané Sönam Topgyé, 1689 to 1747, and the courtly center of Polha, Tibet, 1728 to 1750, the last lay dynasty to rule central Tibet. Polhané is well known for brokering central Tibet's ties to the Qing Empire, a conquest dynasty led by the semi-nomadic Manchus, and the last empire to rule China. The Tibetan king would emerge as an important ally of the Qing emperors as they extended their dominion over Inner Asia in the 18th century. These vestigial ruins serve as the point of departure for my book project in progress. Mirrors of History traces the rise and fall of the short-lived Polha dynasty, a period which has traditionally been viewed as a mere staging post to Qing imperial domination of Tibet. The book offers a revisionist history of Qing-Tibetan relations, uncovering a lost vision of Buddhist kingship amidst shifting political tides. As a cultural and intellectual history, it recovers Tibetan responses to the Qing encounter at the Polha court, which became a key partner in the Qing imperial project. I emphasize how Tibetan responses to the extension of Qing authority were framed through a novel model of kingship within empire, highlighting not only how Tibetan elites negotiated imperial power, but also the potency of Tibetan Buddhist intellectual traditions to reconcile with the political, social, and cultural upheavals brought about by Qing rule. The book is structured as an introduction with 6 thematic chapters and epilogue, tracing not just the Polha dynasty from 1728 to 1750, but also its long shadow across the early regency period of the Ganden Podang and into the present day. I'll give you a brief rundown of the chapters. Chapter 1 introduces the lay elites at the Polha court and introduces how imperial grace through Qing titles, patronage, gifts, and marriage alliances created enduring networks of loyalty between Tibetan noblemen and Beijing. Chapter 2 looks at how Polhané and his courtiers used Sanskrit-inflected Tibetan poetics, or kavya, to craft a new genre of poetic history. Chapter 3 focuses on Dokharwa's 1733 biography of Polhané, better known as the Miwan Topgyé. Chapter 4 examines how Polhané navigated the absence of the Dalai Lama by cultivating alliances with Gelugpa elites to legitimize his lay rule. Chapter 5 explores a network of poetic letters and correspondence exchanged in the aftermath of the 1750 so-called rebellion. Chapter 6 turns to the politics of memory during the early regency period of the Ganden Podang, and the epilogue follows the legacy of Polhané into modern debates about Tibetan sovereignty. What I'll present today is a limited thematic overview, drawing primarily from chapters 1, 3, and a small smattering of chapter 6. These chapters speak to two central questions that structure the book, and I believe reorient our understanding of the 18th century Qing Tibetan encounter. And together they also raise broader implications for how we think about Qing Empire building in its borderlands, and offer sort of new ways to conceptualize the experience of early modern empire in non-Western contexts. The first question is, what does the history of empire look like from its borders? Specifically, how does the process of Qing multi-ethnic expansion appear when viewed from the vantage point of the Polha court in central Tibet? And secondly, what is a king to an emperor? Or rather, how did a Tibetan king articulate an ambitious model of rulership and governance from within the framework of imperial authority at a moment of profound political transformation? Many of you will already be familiar with this geography, but I'd like to begin with some brief context. The Tibetan Plateau covers over 2.5 million square kilometers, roughly a quarter of contemporary China's total territory, and occupies a position of critical geopolitical and environmental significance. Strategically, Tibet's location at the heart of Asia places it at the crossroads of key regional powers. And in recent years, the contested Himalayan border has become the site of inflamed clashes between Chinese and Indian troops. As the source of many of Asia's great rivers and a water source for hundreds of millions across the continent, its rich mineral resources, including lithium and rare earth elements, have also attracted growing interest as China seeks to harness its vast natural wealth. It's no surprise then that Tibet lies at the heart of what in official PRC state rhetoric is referred to as the frontier question, or the Bianjiang Wenti. For the purposes of this talk, I'll be focusing specifically on central Tibet during what we know as the Ganden Podang era, as illustrated in this map from Karl Reivich's brilliant historical atlas of Tibet, through which we can visualize the territory over which the Polha dynasty claimed dominion in the early to mid 18th century. Amidst entrenched political and territorial disputes surrounding Tibet's status following its invasion and occupation by the PRC, the archives of Sino-Tibetan history continue to provoke contestation. While access to archival resources in the PRC remains imperiled in the post-COVID era, I was fortunate to be able to draw across a diverse and multilingual range of sources for my book during my research. The book is based on research across China, Taiwan, India, and Europe. I read across the accounts of Tibetan literati-statesmen, Qing imperial chroniclers, and monastic intellectuals to examine how the Polha court was influenced by, responded to, and imagined this formative encounter between Tibet and the Qing Empire. Marshalling these resources, today I want to convince you of two things. Firstly, that Qing rule in Tibet was a series of fraught and protracted negotiations mediated by the Polha court. And secondly, that the Polha court helped consolidate imperial rule while simultaneously enacting Polhané's own political ambitions through a novel form of Buddhist kingship. And to do so, I will lead you through some of the central arguments and conceptual interventions that I make to reconcile this pair of questions. The idea that East Asian international relations were based on a Sino-centric tribute system where China's cultural superiority shaped its hierarchical relationships with its neighbors originate from John King Fairbank's 1968 book, The Chinese World Order. According to this model, the Qing viewed their relationships with neighboring states in terms of Confucian hierarchy rather than conquest. While recent scholarship has challenged the tributary model, the concept of a Chinese world order remains influential in both academic and popular discussions. From the 1990s onwards, the new Qing historians working in Manchu language sources have argued against this model, emphasizing that the Qing dynasty, unlike the Ming before it, was not a Han Chinese regime. Instead, the Qing should be understood as a multi-ethnic conquest empire that ruled over a culturally diverse population, including many non-Han peoples, such as the Mongols, Tibetans, and Uyghurs, through flexible and indirect governance. Qing historians have uncovered how efforts to define, delimit, and maintain ethnic groups were woven into the ideological and institutional fabric of the empire itself. Indeed, as Manchus, the emperors considered the maintenance of ethnic and regional difference to be central to the imperial project, both to preserve their position as the conquest elite and to consolidate expansion. The Qing Empire, in this regard, was like many other empires, who, in the words of Jane Burbank and Frederick Cooper, were committed to, quote, self-consciously maintaining the diversity of people they conquered and incorporated, end quote. Qing expansion in Inner Asia in the 18th century, depicted on the right-hand side of this map, can be understood as a century-long attempt to dominate the Tibetan Buddhist ecumen, or the shared religious and civilizational domain of Tibetan Buddhist influence in Inner Asia, stretching from contemporary Mongolia through parts of northern China to large portions of Central Asia. From the early 17th century onwards, clashes amongst various Mongol rulers and polities were intimately tied to Buddhist sectarian conflict in Tibet. From the mid-17th to the mid-18th century, the Qing battled for supremacy over this region against their rivals, the Jungar Khanate, a powerful federation of Oirad Mongols who were seen as an existential threat to Manchu rule. These rival polities sought a monopoly on the patronage of the Dalai Lamas and the Gelugpa institutions, whose potent influence stretched across the Inner Asian region. The arrival of the victorious Qing army into Tibet in 1720 marked the beginning of a shift of power in Inner Asia, ending the short-lived Jungar regime in Tibet, 1717 to 1720, and installing the 7th Dalai Lama in the Potala Palace. The Qing emperors became the sole custodians of the Gelugpa school and Tibetan Buddhism at large. The Qing were confronted with the reality of maintaining indirect governance by cultivating relationships with members of the local elite. The two imperatives of early Qing policy in Tibet were to secure the region militarily and to establish a governing structure that would facilitate imperial rule. These aims would only be realized through the cooperation of Tibetan elites. The first stage of Qing elite patronage can be traced to the aftermath of the 1720 campaign. The Qing granted imperial titles, privileges, and gifts to 5 Tibetan noblemen, thus forming the first in several iterations of a council that would govern Tibet until the mid-20th century. 2 members of this council, Polhané Sönam Topgyé of the Gushi clan and Polhané, then the young hierarch of the Polha clan, were singled out for their contributions to the war effort against the Jungar. Both came from relatively obscure provincial backgrounds, but in the 1720s, they held the strategically important western border regions of Ngari and Nugchu, which were seen by key Qing frontier officials like Nian Gengyao and Yue Zhongqi to be entry points for further Jungar incursions. By 1726, Kangchenay had emerged as the right hand of the Qing in Tibet. In this 1726 edict, Kangchenay is appointed as regent of Tibet with authority over all affairs of governance. The trust that he enjoyed from the Qing court owed to the grace, Huang En in Chinese, he had received from the Kangxi emperor in reward for his efforts against the Jungars and his devotion to the Gelug school. I term these ascendant elites who would dominate the governance of Tibet for the next 2 centuries a service elite, a hereditary group of elites that drew special privileges from a direct relationship to an external source. First, the Koshod Mongol military institutions of the early Ganden Podang and later the Qing court. Doing so allows us to think outside of national boundaries and towards a conversation about trans-regional elites, with parallels among the samurai, the munshi, and janissaries in early modern Japanese, South Asian, and Ottoman contexts. Reading across the archive of the Qing Tibetan encounter during the early years of my research, I was struck by the reoccurrence of the Chinese term imperial grace, Huang En, to frame the relationship between Tibetan elites and the Qing court. What exactly was imperial grace? And how was it understood by Tibetans 2,000 miles away from Beijing? What role did it have in stitching together a multi-ethnic Qing imperium across linguistic and religious boundaries? As I pored over archival documents, these lines of inquiry would help me understand how the delicate relationship between the imperial court and their Tibetan allies was settled. Early 18th century Qing edicts marked the first expressions of imperial grace in Tibetan, a concept that would become shared across Chinese, Mongolian, Manchu, and Turkey, which together comprise the five languages of the multilingual Qing imperium. Noblemen who received titles from the Qing emperor were regarded as beneficiaries of his favor, a privilege that elevated subjects but was never fully earned. This asymmetrical relationship demanded that recipients continually prove their loyalty and competence, reinforcing the power imbalance between the emperor and his subjects. As the Qing expanded westward from China proper, doubling the territory of their predecessors, the discourse of imperial grace was shaped through elite encounters and layered multilingual practices in the inner Asian theater. Mirrors of History traces this translingual practice, arguing that the initial equivalences established in Tibetan Inner Asia during the Kangxi and Yongjung period would contribute to a standardized imperial lexicon. During the late Qianlong era, we see the crystallization of multilingual governance with Qing court productions such as the 1794 Pentaglot Dictionary, pictured here, equating the Tibetan term gading with the Mongolian kesig, Manchu Kesi, Turkic Kesik, and Chinese definitively. And here's a page selected at random from the Petaglot Dictionary. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to locate the specific entry for grace in my collection of images, but still this gives a sense of the multilingual imperial project in which Tibet and the Tibetan language was deeply embedded. In Tibetan, imperial grace carried two affective dimensions: the compassion of one's parents, Pamegadin, symbolizing filial piety, and the compassion of Alama Lamegadin, evoking the devotion of a disciple. And these dimensions portrayed the Qing emperor cosmologically as the Buddha of wisdom, Manjushri, and as a loving parent whose compassion required reciprocal service. And this dual interpretation resonated not only with Confucian concepts of filial piety, but also with broader inner Asian norms of kinship and paternalism. And thus, the Tibetan understanding of imperial grace reinforced the idea of reciprocal obligations between the emperor and his subjects, binding trans-regional elite constituencies across a diverse imperium. The execution of three Tibetan ministers following the civil war of 1727 to 1728 illustrated that the Qing court had the power to extinguish entire elite lineages. The brutal dispensation of imperial justice also established the supremacy of the Polha clan. In the aftermath of the war, Yue Zhongqi, then Governor General of Sichuan Shanxi, sent a secret memorial to the Qing court, reiterating Polhané's loyalty to the empire through the rhetoric of imperial grace. In the vacuum created by Kang Chen's murder, which had sparked the civil war, Yue Zhongqi's endorsement of Polhané's loyalty heralded his ascent to King of Tibet. To reflect his newfound authority, the Yongjung emperor elevated Polhané to lofty imperial rank with later successive promotion. And to this point, we have looked at edicts, memorials, and other sources that emanated from the imperial center. And as we can see, the language of imperial grace was highly formulaic. reading across sources produced in Beijing, we have little to no idea as to how these communications were received by Tibetan actors. Were these reciprocal bonds between emperor and subject merely a centrifugal aspiration on behalf of an expansionist Qing Empire? And to what extent did the language of loyalty, the Qing language of loyalty, permeate Tibetan elite understandings of political relationship and affiliation? In the biography, in the royal biography of Polhané Topgyé, and in response to his Qing court endorsement, Polhané is described as hailing Yongzheng as Manjushri and identifies himself as a grateful recipient of imperial grace. He also engages in self-abnegation, identifying himself as a lowly shrew. Attending to the language of loyalty in the 1733 Tibetan account, we can see the repurposing of language directly from official imperial sources, such as the 1726 Yongzheng Edict. A mere 13 years after the Qing arrival in Lhasa, the Tibetan language of loyalty was beginning to be heavily influenced by the official rhetorical registers of the Qing court. Exiling the young 7th Dalai Lama to eastern Tibet, Polhané launched a bold and ambitious project of Buddhist kingship. The Tibetan king was a nimble curator of elite networks during the post-Civil War period. Polhané drew upon imperial grace as an associative discourse to redefine notions of authority, linking the Tibetan ruling family directly to the Qing emperors and recalibrating social hierarchies to create layered forms of loyalty and affiliation beneath them. Polhané, acting as a broker of imperial grace, negotiated imperial titles for his own council of ministers, depicted here in this chart, and organized strategic marriage alliances between the core courtly families. These new courtly families thus in turn internalized the concept of imperial grace, incorporating both the rhetoric of imperial and royal service in Tibetan elite culture. The materiality of imperial grace is captured by Polhané's distribution of official Qing accoutrements for his courtiers. Hat finials, such as the example pictured here, were symbols of distinction in Qing official costume, and their award became greatly prized by the Tibetan elite. From the 18th century onwards, hat finials became a formal part of Tibetan state dress. They were a direct link between the Polha court and the Qing emperors, and along with other inner Asian luxury goods such as sable fur pelts and dragon robes, they were distinctive visual markers for a new culturally fluid Tibetan elite class. And this material hybridity illustrated the immersion of Polhané's courtly elite in the visual and material economies of the Qing Empire. Polhané died on March 12, 1747. Plans for succession in the Polha dynasty had, however, been struck since 1746, when the Tibetan ruler arranged with the Qing court for his son Gyurme Namgyel to succeed him. Discussing succession with the imperial resident in Lhasa, Qianlong reiterated that a strong Tibetan ruler who governed in concert with a council of nobles was critical to the Qing project. Owing to the Polha clan's loyal service, Qianlong readily assented to Gyurme Namgyel's succession. The decision was confirmed in this trilingual Manchu-Mongolian-Tibetan edict pictured. As we see across linguistic registers, Qianlong's special regard for the Polha family was expressed as an exceptional level of grace, Te-en or Kasig, that owed to Polhané's service to 3 successive Qing emperors. Yet, emperors are fickle masters. In late 1750, the Qing imperial residents in Tibet murdered Gyurme Namgyel, suspecting him of collusion with the Jungar, and this marked the rather abrupt end of Polha kingship. The years to come would see the restoration of the Dalai Lama, the 1751 centralizing reforms, and a new system of rule by imperially appointed monastic regents. Pivoting around this moment of transition, I argue that Qing-Tibetan elite relations from here on centered on the inheritance of imperial grace by descendants of the Polha elite. And this was a hereditary system termed prosaically in Tibetan as following in the father's footsteps. Although the system of kingship was formally abolished in in the 1751 reforms, Qianlong and successive emperors would continue to patronize the Polha family until the 20th century. Through the Regency era, core families of the Polha court would have continued influence at the highest levels of governance, inheriting imperial titles and intergenerational imperial grace through the 18th and 19th centuries. The prevailing view of multi-ethnic Qing rule has hinged on a model of discrete ethno-linguistic constituencies and the curation of culturally appropriate governance for each constituency. Rule over its Tibetan constituency is understood largely to have been mediated through imperial patronage of Buddhist monastic elites, foremost of them the Dalai Lamas and their associated institutions, reframing the Qing expansion to Tibet as a series of mutual interpretations between the Polha court and the Qing court provides insight into Qing rule in Tibet as a dynamic process, moving us beyond the notion of empire as a monolithic top-down project of domination. As Emma Rothschild has remarked, the history of families has been the history of empires. Across British, Ottoman, and Mughal contexts, ties of kinship and affiliation connected families to sources of authority separated by thousands of miles. Thousands of miles. Combing the multilingual articulation of imperial grace unsettles the notion of a homogeneous Tibetan constituency and allows us to think of Inner Asia as a laboratory of multilingual governance. It also allows us to draw comparisons with the role of elites in other non-Chinese territories of the Qing, from Xinjiang to Mongolia, as well as with the role of trans-regional elite intermediaries in other early modern empires. While best known for negotiating Qing rule, Polhané was also a worldly and cosmopolitan monarch who governed a multi-ethnic and religiously plural population of his own. The 18th century was a period of increased mobility and connectedness across Tibet, in Asia, and the Himalayas, facilitated by Buddhist institutional networks, technological developments, and flows of capital tied to imperial and state building projects. Beyond his relationship with the Qing, Polhané's court engaged with a wide range of actors, from the Torguts of the Volga to the Mughal Empire, and even to Pope Clement XII via Capuchin missionaries. You can see one such example here, drawn from the Vatican archives by Luciano Petek. There is, of course, much more work to be done in tracing the full extent of these trans-regional connections, but I won't be able to cover it today, nor is my book intended as a comprehensive history of Polha rule. Instead, I focus on a set of thematic interventions, particularly around the concept of kingship in empire and a reappraisal of Qing-Tibetan relations. Polhané sought to establish his court as a civilizational center. A refined and courtly sensibility was inculcated by a focus on Buddhist literary education that engendered elite laymen and monastics alike with interdependent notions of ethical behavior, just governance, and connoisseurship. In addition to the patronage of Buddhist institutions, construction projects, and infrastructural reforms, the Polha court drew on their refined sensibilities to participate in a wide range of other royal cultural productions, such as this lavishly illustrated anthology of the Jataka. I argue that together, these Buddhist material, ritual, astrological, and literary productions formed a technology of kingship that established Polhané's identity as a Chakravartin, or universal Buddhist monarch who would restore the Golden Age, or a Buddhist utopia. Returning to my second question, what is a king to an emperor, requires engaging with the cultural and intellectual architecture of Polha kingship, while taking the Tibetan Buddhist systems of knowledge-making that birthed them seriously. In 1733, the Tibetan minister Dokar Ring Wangye, 1697 to 1763, the foremost of intellectuals at the Polha court, published the Miwang Dokje, a monumental royal biography, which I refer to in my book as Delighting the World, as a nod to its lesser-known and fuller literary title, Jigden Gunta. Widely regarded as both a masterpiece of Tibetan literature and and as a crucial source for understanding 18th century Sino-Tibetan political history, the text gained widespread readership across Inner Asia and the Himalayas. And in my book, I depart from classical philological approaches to interpret this text as a distinctive form of Buddhist political theory that responded to pressing questions about sovereignty and imperial power raised by the expansion of Qing rule over central Tibet and Inner Asia. Dokkarwa's portrayal of the Tibetan king articulated an innovative model of kingship and of kingship that emphasized negotiation and diplomacy, aimed at reconciling the relationship between royal and imperial authority. Dokkarwa's approach to Buddhist cosmological models diverged from previous theorists of kingship, but was influenced by a historic Tibetan engagement with Indic political thought. Dokkarwa drew upon a categorization of Chakravartin kingship found in Vasubandhu's Abhidharmakosha, which outlined a hierarchical system of tiered gold, silver, copper, and iron Chakravartin rulers pictured here in this table. Notably, he argues for the coexistence of two Chakravartin rulers whose reigns are intertwined. The Qing emperors, who he identifies as the Golden Chakravartin, and Polhané, who he identifies as the Iron Chakravartin. Moreover, Polhané's situated form of kingship is a model that inherently recognizes and grapples with the limitations of a king's authority. Thus, Dokkarwa interprets Qing rule through the hierarchical typology of kings, sublimating Polhané's kingship to the ascendancy of the Qing emperors, which accounted for the overlapping sovereignties of 18th century Inner Asia. In his effort to reconcile millennia-old Buddhist kingship theory and governance with the realities of imperial rule, Dokkarwa drew upon a range of literary, religious, prophetic, and intellectual traditions to reimagine the boundaries of royal and imperial authority. This was an example of Buddhist world-making, thus aimed, as Ayesha Ramachandran has recently argued, to synthesize new global experiences into a structure that would bind individual fragments into a collective unity. Most of my presentation to this point has come from the early chapters of my book, which look at the material and intellectual dimensions of Qing imperialism in Tibet and in Asia. I'd like to shift now to the closing chapters and epilogue to think about the afterlife of Polha rule and its implications for later Qing rule in Tibet, for the present day, and even for the practice of history. Combing the architecture of Polha kingship requires engaging with Tibetan sources which defy easy categorization by the modern historian. Tackling ritual, literary, astrological, and other forms of Buddhist knowledge production necessitates broaching the problem of form, or rather the literary form of our Polha court sources, which were largely written in Nyangak, an inheritance from the Sanskrit tradition of court poetry known as Kavya, which many of you will be familiar with, which had been indigenized in Tibet since the 13th century as the language of high literature. The role of Rigne at the Buddhist fields of knowledge and Nyangak in particular at the Polha court is something I explore in greater detail in chapter 2, where I consider how Tibetan literati-statesmen drew upon poetics as a medium of political thought, self-fashioning, and historical reflection. With contemporary PRC claims to be the rightful successors to the vast Qing territories, the 18th century archive has become a site of contestation for the competing nationalist historiographies of Sino-Tibetan relations written by 20th century historians in China, India, and the West. While previous generations of historians have mined some of these Tibetan sources for quote-unquote useful historical facts, they viewed the language and literary form of these sources as an obstacle. Conversely, my book takes the deep investment in modes of aesthetics, experimentation, and poetic style as a springboard towards a broader inquiry into literature, culture, and power, particularly the role of narrative and history amidst overlapping projects of kingship, state building, and imperial expansion. Taking the architecture of Polha kingship as a legitimate form of history writing reveals a form of early modern Buddhist kingship that responded to the transformations of the 18th century, offering an alternative to Westphalian notions of sovereignty. Recovering a Poetics of Kingship also opens up new conversations between East and South Asia that have been occluded by colonial modernity and the siloed lens of the area studies model. Central Tibetan laymen ceased to fashion themselves as kings. Yet notions of Buddhist kingship did not lose their potency for imagining new political identities and relationships. Instead, the project of Buddhist royal self-fashioning became the prerogative of the Qing emperors themselves. Here we have the Qianlong emperor depicted by the Jesuit court painter Giuseppe Castiglione as part of a lineage of Gelugpa teachers, including the Dalai Lama himself. Qianlong invested in a range of material, visual, and textual projects that sought to cast the emperor as the Chakravartin ruler par excellence and as custodian of the Gelugpa teachings. Centering on the Qing Emperor's association with the Bodhisattva Manjushri, this imperial project of Buddhist kingship was enacted across the Buddhist Inner Asian landscape and supported by a coterie of trans-regional Lama interlocutors. The prestige and elasticity of the Tibetan poetic form Nyangak was not lost in Qianlong's transcendent self-fashioning. Multilingual poetry stelae dotting the imperial landscape from Beijing to Chengde to Wutaishan bear traces of the Indic influence on verses attributed to the emperor himself. To close, let us return to the Ganden Kangsa. The rule of the Polha dynasty lasted just over 2 decades. While many of its institutional structures and networks were fundamental to future iterations of the Tibetan Ganden Podang state, by the early 19th century, the legacy of central Tibet's last kingdom was contested and in danger of being forgotten. The rise of Qing court-appointed Lama regents from 1757 onwards represented the triumph of a century-long history of Gelugpa institutional networking in Inner Asia, and the slow ascendancy towards a form of imperial rule that some scholars have termed colonial. Together with the eradication of the Jungar threat circa 1757 and the immense fiscal burden of the Jinchuan campaigns 1747 to 1776, the fall of the Polha kingdom in 1750 signposts the transition between the flexible, non-direct imperial rule that had characterized the early decades of the 18th century and the more centralized forms of domination that the Qing would extend over its borderlands in the latter half of the 18th century and beyond. Moreover, this transition towards coercive forms of rule can be seen as the death knell for ambitious elites like Polhané. It had been through these elites that early Qing rule in Tibetan Inner Asia had been brokered and maintained, but from the imperial perspective, hereditary elites were deemed too volatile, too unpredictable, and perhaps too inefficient counterparts for a more ambitious project of control. Buddhist monastic historians would enfold the rule of Polhané into a succession of lay regents in the Ganden Podang institution, ignoring the intellectual and material architecture of the Polha kingdom. By the early 20th century, Polhané was only a footnote in a influential institutional history of the Ganden Podang, with the text briefly mentioning that he ruled as a regent for 20 years. Why then is Polha rule important today? Contemporary PRC territorial claims over the Tibetan region have hinged on nationalist and ahistorical readings of the Qing archive. Histories of this formative period have often reiterated narratives of empire building that emanate from the imperial center, yet the initial Qing expansion into central Tibet was negotiated by the Polha court, ruled by a provincial military official who dared to style himself a universal Buddhist king. Mirrors of History shifts our attention to the lost vision of Polha kingship to foreground the role of cosmopolitan Tibetan elites in the brokering of Qing imperial power through a series of encounters and negotiations, eschewing previous notions of Qing rule as fait accompli. Following the invasion of Tibet, debates about the historical sovereignty of Tibet vis-a-vis PRC nation building would occur within the framework of modern disciplinary history. 20th century historians from China, Tibet, and Europe sought to mine the 18th century archive for evidence of Tibet's sovereignty or lack thereof. These historians came from vastly different backgrounds, wrote in different languages, and had divergent political aims. Yet they shared a commitment to positivism as a defining feature of disciplinary history. This commitment to positivism, an inheritance of a 19th century German historical science and a legacy of the colonial episteme, required the taxonomizing of historical sources in a process that necessarily disaggregated quote unquote useful historical facts from the chaff that remained illegible to the secular eye of the modern historian. The fluid and plural nature of early modern geopolitical relationships depicted in the sophisticated Tibetan accounts of Qing rule produced at the Polha court were thereby transmuted by a generation of philologists and historians into claims of geopolitical sovereignty. Recovering an early modern reading of Polha kingship as it responded to Qing imperialism is my own attempt at rescuing Tibetan history, not just from the nation, but from history itself. Thank you. Thank you very much. Very much appreciate the opportunity to share my research with you, and I'd be happy to take any questions at this point. You can stop the share.